Does he know I'm going to read this statement?
Counsel, he's ready for either one.
Okay. The next witness will be Miss Fawn Hall. Miss Hall, would you rise, please, and raise your right hand in order to take the oath? Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony that you are about to give this committee is the truth and the whole truth? Yes, I do. You may be seated. Ms. Hall, would you please bring the microphone right close to you so that we may hear you? That's a voice-activated microphone, and it has to be very close. Ms. Hall, after you declined to answer any questions of the staff on the ground that your answer might tend to incriminate you, both the House and Senate committees secured orders of use immunity compelling you to testify. These orders provide in substance that you may not refuse to provide evidence on the basis of your privilege against self-incrimination. The orders provide that evidence obtained from you under the order may not be used against you in any criminal proceeding. A copy of the orders have been provided to your counsel, and pursuant to the order, I direct you to answer the questions put to you, and I yield to the chairman of the Senate Select Committee.
I wish to have the record show that I concur with the chairman's order.
Ms. Hall is prepared to accept the directions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Hall, I understand you have an opening statement. Am I correct?
Yes, sir.
And you may proceed.
I'd like to begin with my name. My name is Fawn Hall, and I reside with my parents in Northern Virginia, where I was born and raised. I attended Annandale High School and graduated in 1977. I started working at the age of 15, and at 16, while still in high school, began my career in government, working for the Department of the Navy. During this period, I also held various part-time jobs, including modeling. I worked for the Navy from 1977 until February of 1983. In February 1983, I was detailed by the Department of Defense to the National Security Council and accepted a position as secretary to then Major Oliver North, United States Marine Corps. I was Lieutenant Colonel North's personal secretary until he left the National Security Council on November 25, 1986. For the nearly 4 years that I worked for Lieutenant Colonel North, my hours were long and arduous, but I found my job to be most fulfilling. During my tenure at the National Security Council, I came to have enormous admiration and respect for not only Lieutenant Colonel North, but for many with whom we worked. I admired them not only for their hard work and professional abilities, but also for their selflessness and deep sense of dedication and loyalty to the President and our country. As a secretary, it was my job to facilitate the smooth operation of the office. I was a dedicated and a loyal secretary and performed my duties in an exemplary manner. I can type. During November 1986, events occurred at the National Security Council, which have resulted in my being here today. Although I did not know many of the details relevant to the Iran-Contra initiative, I strongly believed then, as I do now, that the efforts made to support the Contras, obtain the release of the American citizens being held hostage, and respond to moderates in a country as strategically as important as Iran were carried out with only the best of intentions and the interests of this country, the United States. Lieutenant Colonel North had a large portfolio on the NSC staff. He worked tirelessly to carry out the administration's policies with regard to Central America and international counterterrorism. Much of his work is widely recognized. The streamlining of crisis management, the President's National Bipartisan Commission on Central America, the liberation of Grenada, the administration's actions in eliminating death squad activities in El Salvador, the U.S. response in Libya to Colonel Gaddafi's actions against U.S. citizens and interests, the actions to end the numerous terrorist attacks on our innocent persons, such as the TWA 847 and Aquila Laura incident, and the daily efforts to obtain the release of our American citizens held hostage in Beirut. These are major issues of which he was a central and effective player, but they do not include his day-to-day responsibilities of dealing with other interagency issues or public inquiries. I admire Lieutenant Colonel North for his professional integrity and beliefs, his personal commitment to this country, and his ability to be a friend when one is needed. I'd like to take the time to reflect a little bit on Colonel North's, what I was very touched by one time. We were working in the office, and we were working on a crisis, and a gentleman walked in the office and delivered us a copy of the National Bipartisan Commission report and explained that an American citizen, an electrician, had found it in a hotel and had seen the presidential seal and thought it to be a very important document that he should get back to the White House. And it made its way up from the sit room, I believe, to Colonel North because it had to do with Central America. Colonel North at this time said he was very touched by the fact that someone had taken the time to return what he thought was an important document, and he was touched by it also, and said, I think we should try to see if we can't get the president to write this man a letter and thank him. And I think that reflects a little bit on Colonel North's sensitivity. I think it's important. I believe Lieutenant Colonel North has been and continues to be completely loyal to the President and the United States. I would also like at this time to recognize his wife Betsy and their 4 children for their commitment and their sacrifices. I have cooperated fully with the Independent Counsel's Office and with members of this staff and this committee. In particular, I have been treated with great courtesy and respect by Chief Counsel Arthur Lyman, Executive Assistant Mark Belnick, and Chief Counsel John Niels and Deputy Counsel Richard Leone of the House. I appear here to testify and cooperate fully with you as to my personal knowledge of the events into which this committee is inquiring. My testimony will be based solely upon my perspective as a secretary, not that of a policymaker or a policy analyst. I would prefer to have remained a relatively obscure but responsible secretary at the National Security Council, doing, as a friend of mine paraphrased Franklin Roosevelt, the best I know how at the moment for what is right. That option now having been foreclosed, I'm prepared to answer your questions to the best of my ability.
Thank you, Ms. Hall. Questions will begin with Mr. Belnick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hall, I take it that you've spent your entire adult career working for various government departments.
Correct.
From June 1976 to October 1977, you were a clerk, steno secretary, assigned to the Chief of Naval Operations of the Department of the Navy.
That's right.
Thereafter, from October 1977 until February 1983, you were assigned as an administrative support assistant to the Chief of Naval Operations.
Correct.
Starting in February 1983, as you said in your opening statement, until November 25, 1986, you were a secretary to Lieutenant Colonel North.
That's correct.
From November 25, 1986, until January 9, 1987, you served as a secretary to Ambassador Oakley.
That's right.
And from that time until the present, you've been employed at the Department of Defense as a secretary.
That's correct.
Ms. Hall, would you describe what your general duties were for Lieutenant Colonel North during the period that you served as his personal secretary?
I carried out the normal responsibilities of a secretary. I answered phones, took messages, relayed messages, typed, filed, kept a calendar, took care of his travel, etc.
Was it your practice at any time to sit in on meetings that Colonel North had?
No.
To listen in on telephone conversations?
No.
Was it Colonel North's practice from time to time to discuss his activities at the office with you?
No.
Now, you say you kept Colonel North's calendar. Was that a fairly accurate record of Colonel North's meetings on a daily basis?
I believe so.
And would you turn in your book to Exhibit FH9 and tell us whether you recognize that exhibit as consisting of certain pages from the calendar you kept for Colonel North?
Yes, sir.
Now, did you also keep a log of Colonel North's incoming telephone calls?
Yes, I did.
And that, too, was a fairly accurate record of those calls?
I wouldn't call it an accurate record. It was a log. It was a I didn't keep all incoming calls. If he was there to receive a call, it did not go in the log. That was just to keep track of messages which he needed to return, calls he needed to return. It was not an accurate record of outgoing calls or incoming calls, no.
You kept a record of those calls that needed to be returned when
Correct.
messages were left. And do you know where those logs are today?
They were shredded,
In November of 1986.
yes.
And we'll get to that later. Would you describe what your working hours were like, Ms. Hall, during the 4 years that you served Colonel North?
We worked very long hours. I usually put in at least a 12-hour day.
Usually starting when?
It varied. Sometimes I would start at 8. A lot of times I started at 10, and we worked on till 9 or 10 at night, usually sometimes later and sometimes earlier.
You rarely left the office, as I understand, before 7 or 8 in the evening.
Almost never.
Okay. Was it Colonel North's practice to dictate memoranda of his meetings?
No, it wasn't.
Would he at certain times dictate minutes of meetings he attended?
He would dictate minutes as requested by the National Security Council in which the President was present.
And as I understand it, on those occasions when Colonel North dictated memoranda to you, you usually typed them directly into your word processor.
Correct.
Now, do you recall the general matters that Colonel North was working on when you became his secretary in 1983 and as it progressed over the years?
I believe when I first began working for him, he was working on development of a crisis management center, and he was working military exercises and Central America. And then when the terrorism incidents began to become more frequent, he picked up that as part of his duties.
And in the course of time, as we'll discuss further, you became at least familiar with his work on what is now known as the Iran Initiative.
Correct.
And you also became familiar with his work in support of the Nicaraguan freedom fighters.
Correct.
All right, now, Ms. Hall, I'd like to turn with you to a description of Colonel North's offices. My understanding is that when you first came to work for Colonel North in February of 1983, he was in room 392 of the old Executive Office Building.
That's correct.
And that was a one-floor office.
Yes.
Colonel North had a private office there,
Yes.
and you worked outside that office.
Correct.
All right. Now, sometime in early 1986, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Earl and Commander Craig Coy began to work with Colonel North. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And they were assigned reporting to him as part of the unit that Colonel North headed up at the National Security Council.
Correct.
There then came a time, as I understand, in May of 1986, when you moved offices.
Yes.
And when was that move, Ms. Hall?
It was in May of 1986.
Was it around the time that Lieutenant Colonel North and Mr. McFarland went to Tehran?
It was during that time, yes.
And what suite did you move to?
Suite 302.
Now, do you recall that during one of our interviews I asked you to prepare a sketch of Suite 302, and you did that for us?
Yes.
And would you look at FH Exhibit 10 and confirm that that is a rendering of the sketch you prepared for us of Suite 302?
Yes, it is.
And we also have a blown-up version of that office on the side. Now, Suite 302 was a two-floor office, correct?
Yes.
Colonel North's office was downstairs,
Yes.
and your desk was immediately outside his
Yes.
office. Next to you was a secretary named Barbara Brown.
Yes.
She came to the NSC around June of 1986,
I believe so, yes.
and she was the secretary for Lieutenant Colonel Earl and for Commander Coy.
Yes.
All right. Upstairs in the second floor of Suite 302, Commander Coy's office was on the left of the diagram, correct?
Yes.
And Colonel Earl's office over on the right.
Yes.
All right. Now, if you'll go back to the first floor of Suite 302 and look directly opposite your desk, that's where the shredding machine was,
Yes, sir.
and there are two safes next to that. One of those safes, the one to the left, which is highlighted in blue on our chart, was a 5-drawer safe, correct?
Correct.
Where was that safe when you were in your previous office, room 392?
It was inside Colonel North's private office.
Had you ever seen the safe open when it was in Colonel North's private office in room 392?
Yes, sir.
What did the safe contain when you saw it open at that time prior to May 1986?
In the top drawer, it contained miscellaneous files and projects. Perhaps someone might come in and talk to him, and he might just, they might write a letter or something about an idea they had, and he would just file it away in a file there. And also military exercises. The second, third, and fourth drawer, I believe, held files that were completely unrelated to either Central America or Iran. And the bottom drawer held three-ring large notebooks, which I believe were trip reports the security advisors had taken to the regions to visit the heads of state, et cetera.
Did you have the combination to that safe?
At one time I did, yes.
Did you ever have occasion to open it yourself?
Yes.
And that was to file papers when you were in the old office?
Yes.
Did you ever see that office safe opened again after you moved to Suite 302?
I don't believe so, sir.
Not until November 1986?
Yes.
And is that the safe from which Colonel North removed files to be shredded?
Yes.
All right. Did Colonel North make it a practice to take notes of his daily activities?
Yes, he did.
And where did he make those notes?
He kept a thin spiral reporter's notebook.
All right. And he carried that with him?
Yes, he did.
And he marked down items to be completed, meetings, and so forth?
Yes.
I understand that Colonel Earl maintained a similar notebook.
Yes, he did.
Do you know where Colonel North's notebooks are now?
I don't, sir.
Have you seen any of those notebooks subsequent to Colonel North's dismissal from the NSC on November 25, 1986?
Yes, I have, sir.
Where did you see them?
On occasion, I visited Brendan Sullivan's office, that is his lawyer, to drop off telephone messages from friends and acquaintances and fan mail. And I was in the office and I noticed that there was a stack of them in the corner. I mean, there was a stack of notebooks that I don't know that they were his, but they were reporters' notebooks that similar.
They appeared to you to resemble those in which he had made notes.
Yes.
But you didn't go over and look at the notebooks, and so you can't say for sure whether those are the same notebooks that Colonel North maintained.
Correct.
Do you remember how many you estimated that you saw in the stack in Mr. Sullivan's office?
Maybe 10.
All right. And you identified Mr. Sullivan as Mr. North's current attorney.
Yes, I do.
Now, Ms. Hall, did there come a time when you were in the old office, prior to May 1986, that certain secure communication devices, referred to as KL-43s, were delivered to Colonel North's office?
Yes.
And who delivered those devices?
I believe they came from John Wobensmith of the National Security Agency.
All right. And do you recall how many such KL-43 machines Mr. Wobensmith delivered initially?
A couple, I believe.
Did anyone instruct you on how to use the machine?
I believe Colonel North did.
What did he tell you about how to use it and what the purpose of the KL-43 was?
He instructed me how manually to use it, and I understood it to be a secure communications, acting much like a secure phone.
And over the course of time, you became familiar with the fact that General Secord had such a device in his office,
Yes.
and that it was used by General Secord and also by Robert Dutton.
Yes.
Now, the device came with a printer,
It did, yes.
but it was ordinarily your practice, as I understand, to transcribe the messages that came over the machine, type them, and give them to Colonel North that way.
Yes, sir.
And those papers were frequently referred to as KL-43 traffic, correct?
Yes.
All right. Now, you were familiar with General Secord's administrative assistant?
Yes.
Her name was?
Shirley Napier.
And from time to time, did you have occasion to deliver tapes for the KL-43 machines to Miss Napier?
Yes, I did.
Would you describe first for the committees what these tapes were?
It was a small case that had perforated code tapes on it that you ripped off one for each day and plugged into the machine and destroyed at the end of the day.
And these were coded tapes, correct?
Correct.
Supplied to you by or through Mr. Wobensmith.
Yes.
They changed periodically,
Yes.
and so it became necessary for you to make sure that General Secord had the updated tapes, and you did that by delivering the tapes to Miss Napier.
Correct.
And she would pick them up at the old Executive Office building.
Yes, I would meet her out on 17th Street outside the old Executive Office building.
All right. In the course of working with the KL-43 traffic and otherwise in the office, booking Colonel North's travel arrangements, did you become aware of certain of the names that Colonel North used?
Yes, I did.
And what was the name he ordinarily used when he traveled?
William P. Good.
And on the KL-43 messages, did Colonel North refer to himself, and was he referred to frequently by yet another code name?
I think he was used as Good in the KL-43s.
All right. Were there other documents relating to his work with the Contras in which Colonel North used a different code name?
He at one time used the name Mr. Steelhammer.
You recognize that as a name for Colonel North, and there were other pseudonyms used by Mr. Calero. Do you recall? Do you recall that Mr. Calero was referred to from time to time as Barnaby?
Yes, he was referred to as Barnaby or AC or Sparkplug.
In the course of your work, you came to know Spitz Channel,
Yes,
and did he have a name for Colonel North as well?
I remember him referring to him as Mr. Green on a few occasions.
I'd like to talk with you now, Ms. Hall, about some of Colonel North's relationships with certain persons in and outside the government. You knew that the late Director Casey had an office at the old Executive Office building during his term as Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, correct?
Yes,
Was Director Casey a frequent caller to Colonel North?
I would say he was, considering the fact that he was a cabinet member. Yes.
And that Colonel North was a member of the NSC staff?
Yes.
Did he visit Colonel North at times?
I believe he visited our old suite, room 392, on 2 occasions.
And Colonel North went to meetings in Director Casey's office, correct?
Yes.
They had, from your observation, a fairly close relationship, again, given their relative positions in the government.
Correct.
And you heard Colonel North refer to the DCI from time to time as Bill.
Yes.
You wouldn't compare that relationship in any way as the same as Colonel North's dealings with the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense?
No.
Okay. What about Attorney General Meese? Did he call on Colonel North from time to time?
I don't know that he called frequently. I would say it was maybe once or twice, and I believe that Colonel North has visited Attorney General Meese on at least one occasion.
Prior to November 1986?
Yes.
All right. Were you aware of any telephone calls to Colonel North from the President prior to November 1986?
No.
Did Colonel North ever tell you that he had received any such calls from the President?
No.
Were you aware of any one-on-one meetings between Colonel North and the President of the United States prior to November 1986?
No.
And again, Colonel North never claimed to you that he had had such meetings, correct?
No.
Do you know whether Colonel North ever visited the residence at the White House?
I believe he did on one occasion.
Do you recall when that was?
No, I don't, sir.
How do you know that that occurred?
I remember that he came back and mentioned that he said something about having been over in the residence, and I think that Mrs. Reagan was also there.
Did he mention why he had been there or what had been discussed while he was there?
No, sir.
And that was, again, on only one occasion.
Yes, sir.
And I understand that the Vice President did not make any calls to Colonel North so far as you're aware?
I believe the Vice President called on one occasion, and I remember that it was in room 392.
When was that?
I would say late 1985, probably.
Did Colonel North tell you what he and the Vice President discussed on that occasion?
No, sir.
Is that the only occasion of which you're aware that the Vice President telephoned Colonel North?
Yes.
How about any meetings between Colonel North and the Vice President? Are you aware of any?
Yes, sir.
How many occasions?
I don't know on exactly how many occasions. I'd like to explain that the Vice President
Sure.
worked very closely on the hostage situation, and the families visited often, and Colonel North handled that issue, so he was involved in meetings with the Vice President on that subject.
Were these one-on-one meetings?
No, they were not, sir.
Are you aware of any meetings that were solely between the Vice President and Colonel North?
No, sir.
Michael Ledeen, how would you describe his relationship with Colonel North?
I would say they were friends and associates.
Did Michael Ledeen visit Colonel North's office frequently?
Yes, he did.
For what purpose, so far as you observed?
I believed that Michael Ledeen was a consultant to the NSC on terrorism, and he came to the office to read daily DIA terrorism summaries and monthly summaries. He was there for a reading purpose.
And it was up to Colonel North to designate what things he could read while Mr. Ledeen was in the office.
Outside of the daily summaries and monthly summaries, yes.
Did you come to know Rich Miller and Spitz Channel while you were working for Colonel North?
Yes, I did.
And what did you understand their role to be in relation to assistance for the Nicaraguan freedom fighters?
When I first met them, I understood they were trying to get word out to educate the American people, to get the word out about what was the situation that was in Central America through TV commercials, advertisements, and public speeches by Colonel North.
In the course of your activities, did you become aware or come to form the impression that Messrs. Miller and Channel were engaged in raising money for military assistance to the Contras?
I had on a few occasions received telephone calls from Spitz Channel and his other co-workers outlining what they would have liked Colonel North to say during meetings with their contributors.
And yes, go on.
Some of the conversations were about money for airstrips and helicopters, etc.
You took such messages from them and conveyed them to Colonel North?
Not all of them. I took messages, and we were working at such a fast pace. Normally, Colonel North was under a lot of pressure, and a lot of the messages did not get relayed.
Did you ever become aware whether Colonel North himself was engaged in soliciting persons for financial aid to the Contras?
I didn't sit in the meeting, so I don't know if Colonel North solicited these contributors or not.
Did you ever become aware from any other source, recognizing that you didn't sit in on the meetings, that Colonel North was soliciting contributors to aid the Nicaraguan resistance?
I would have to answer the question no, sir, because I don't know that to be a fact.
All right. Did you come to know a Jonathan Miller during your work for Colonel North?
Yes, I did.
And who was he?
When I first met him, he was an assistant to Ambassador Reich, who was head of the public diplomacy section for Latin America at the Department of State. And Jonathan came to work with our office very closely during our efforts to win the vote for aid to the Contras.
Was he a frequent visitor to Colonel North's office?
Yes.
And you recognized he was working with Colonel North on Central American Nicaraguan affairs?
Yes.
You mentioned legislation. Did you know if he was working on any other matters with or for Colonel North relating to Nicaragua?
I know that he knew Rich Miller, and I believe he knew Spitz Channel, and he worked with them in their efforts also.
Did you come to know a gentleman named William Haskell while you worked for Colonel North?
Yes, I did.
And who was he?
I think that Colonel North knew him as a friend, but I knew that he worked at H&R Block.
Would you describe what he looked like?
A rather thin man, blonde hair, glasses.
Did he have one eye?
I believe so, yes.
And did you come to know him by another name as well?
I never confirmed it, but my own instincts told me that he was the gentleman that I had heard referred to as Olmsted.
And did you ever learn precisely which activities Mr. Haskell/Olmsted was working on with Colonel North?
No, sir.
All right. We mentioned before Shirley Napier, General Secord's administrative assistant, and you've testified to having delivered tapes to Miss Napier from time to time for the KL-43 machine. Now, do you recall that apart from those occasions when you delivered tapes to Miss Napier, that she made deliveries of various packages to you at the old executive office building?
I know that she delivered packages, yes.
Do you recall on how many occasions that happened?
I don't recall.
Do you know what those packages were?
No, I don't.
Well, Ms. Napier has testified to the committees on deposition that she made between 6 and 12 deliveries to you during 1986, and that on those occasions, except for one in particular that we'll discuss, she delivered plain envelopes that contained what to her felt like a papery substance. She didn't know what was inside. Now, having described to you that testimony, does it refresh your recollection at all about specific deliveries that Ms. Napier made to you at the OEOB?
I'm sorry, it doesn't, sir.
You do recall, though, generally that she made deliveries?
Yes.
All right. Now, Ms. Napier testified that specifically on August 26, 1986, she delivered $16,000 in cash to you at the old executive office building, contained in a Federal Express envelope. Do you recall an event such as that?
No, I don't, sir.
Ms. Napier testified further that when she delivered this package to you, and she said it was enclosed at the time, that when she delivered this package to you, you spoke to her and asked her, and I'll give you her testimony, whether you had gone to Miami to get the package, or words to that effect. Now, in fact, Ms. Napier testified that she had picked up the $16,000 in cash to be transmitted to Colonel North from an employee of Southern Air Transport in Miami. And again, she testified that she brought it back, gave it to you enclosed in a Federal Express envelope at the OEOB downstairs, and that as she handed it to you, you said to her, in words or substance, "Did you go to Miami and get this, or did you go down there today?" Now, do you recall any conversation like that with Ms. Napier?
Sir, I don't recall the situation, but I don't deny it. There are a lot of things that I don't remember. And I think I would have remembered opening a package that contained $16,000.
You don't recall questioning Ms. Napier on whether she had gone to Florida to pick something up for Colonel North?
I don't remember that specifically, but I don't deny it.
And Colonel North never told you to expect an important delivery from Ms. Napier or a delivery of cash from her?
I don't recall, sir. I can only offer an understanding that maybe I expressed to him that Shirley was coming over with a package, and he says, "Is it the one from Miami?" And then I took those remarks that he made and also repeated them to her. And that's the only explanation I can give. I just don't recall the situation.
You don't have a recollection of it, but as you said, you're not denying Ms. Napier's testimony.
Correct.
I understand you've told me that there were lots of deliveries to Colonel North's office during the years that you worked there.
Yes, a lot. I mean, from all the different departments of the government.
Ms. Hall, did there come a time when you became aware of Colonel North's work on the Iran initiative?
Yes.
When do you recall first learning of that program,
I believe it started with a visit by David Kemshe.
which would be the summer of 1985?
Correct.
Did Colonel North ever explain the program to you?
No, sir.
But over the course of time, you came to understand that, among other things, it involved the transfer of U.S. weapons to Iran, right?
Yes, sir.
That it also involved, as one of the objectives, the release of American hostages that were then being held in Lebanon.
Yes, sir.
Now, were you ever told by Colonel North that the program also involved using proceeds from the Iran arms sales for the benefit of the Contras?
I don't recall that, sir, no.
Do you ever recall Colonel North joking with you, or joking in the office, to the effect that he was stinging the Ayatollah in the Iran arms program, or that it was ironic that the Ayatollah was paying to support the Contras cause?
It's a little unclear to me because I have a recollection of something like that, but I'm not quite clear if it happened during the office or it's something I've thought of since this story has broken. I'm not clear on that.
You don't have any
It sounds familiar, but I'm not clear. I couldn't.
You don't have a specific recollection
No, I
of it?
don't.
All right. Would you turn in your exhibit book, please, Ms. Hall, to the exhibit marked FH8? This is a memo which is dated release of American hostages in Beirut, and as the members of the committee know, it was this memo which was discovered by one of the Attorney General's representatives on November 22, 1986, which led to the announcement of the so-called diversion at the Attorney General's press conference on November 25. I've shown you this memo before. You recall, Ms. Hall?
Yes.
And did you
Yes.
type it?
Yes, I did, sir.
Now, in the upper right-hand corner of this memo, which is otherwise undated, there's a handwritten notation, April. Do you see that on the exhibit?
Yes, I do, sir.
Do you recognize that handwriting?
It's that of Colonel Norris.
Colonel North. Now, do you recall who prepared this document originally? That is, who gave you the memo to take?
I believe Colonel North dictated it to me.
You recall North dictating it to you and you typing it from his dictation.
Yes, sir.
Did the memo go through more than one draft?
My recollection is that it did, sir.
Is it your recollection also that one of the drafts was sent out of the office to Admiral Poindexter?
I believe that Admiral Poindexter made some changes to it, yes.
All right. And you typed those changes and prepared an additional draft?
Yes, sir.
Do you recall whether this memorandum was ever prepared and sent out in a final form?
I don't recall, sir.
Do you know if anyone else saw this memorandum in draft or final, other than you, of course, Colonel North, and Admiral Poindexter?
I don't recall.
If you,
I don't know.
You don't know. If you look at Exhibit 9, the next exhibit, also, Exhibit 8A. Exhibit 8A, which we've also reviewed before during your interviews, you recognize that as another copy of the same memorandum without the handwritten April, right?
Yes.
And the other change we've identified is that in the second full paragraph, where it reads on September 13, September 13 is typed in, whereas on the prior version that we just looked at, Exhibit 8, 13 is written in by hand and 14 is crossed off.
Correct.
You prepared, that is, typed both versions.
Yes, sir.
And I take it that looking at this other version does not affect your recollection as to whether a final was prepared and sent out.
No, it doesn't. I just have to assume that that it was typed for a reason, that it went somewhere. I don't know where it went.
Now, this memorandum, whether in form as Exhibit 8 or 8A, is in a form that's different than the usual memoranda you prepared for Colonel North at the NSC. Am I right?
Yes, sir.
And I'd like just so we can be clear, to review with you what the general form and filing procedures were for intelligence-related documents that you prepared at the NSC. Now, typically, from the documents we've seen, there was a cover sheet that was affixed to the memorandum, correct?
Yes.
And that cover sheet would contain the classification of the document, top secret, secret, code word, correct?
Yes, sir.
There would also be a routing slip that would tell who the different people were who were to receive copies of the documents, right?
Yes, sir.
And then we've seen on the memos themselves, in the upper right corner, and we'll be seeing documents like that later in this examination, something that would say System 4,
Yes,
right?
sir.
And under that, typically a number.
Yes.
Now, would you describe, let's do it this way. The NSC record-keeping system involved 3 different systems, right?
Correct.
System 1, System 2, and System 4.
Yes.
There was no System 3.
Yes.
Now, what were System 1 documents?
System 1 documents were routine, not sensitive documents.
Typically addressed administrative matters.
Correct.
What were System 2 documents?
System 2 were documents that were classified, a little more sensitive, and they included national security decision directives, meetings with presidential minutes, etc.
Minutes of National Security Council meetings and NSPG meetings, those would be System 2.
Yes.
Now, again, there was no System 3, and then we get to System 4, which is the system document that you would ordinarily be dealing with at Colonel North's office, right?
Well, we dealt with all 3 systems.
Okay. What was a System 4 document?
A System 4 document meant that the document involved a lot of sensitivity and intelligence matters.
Those were the most sensitive documents that you dealt with at Colonel North's office, correct?
Correct.
Where were original System 4 documents filed?
After the action had been completed on the document, the original document was returned to the security officer who handled System 4 and filed in his files.
Where was his office in relation to Suite 302?
In relation to Suite 302, it was right next door.
Now, who was the System 4 security officer at the NSC during your tenure until November of 1986?
Jim Radzimski and then Brian Merchant.
Jim Radzimski until November 1986, and then Brian Merchant took over in that month of November, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, Mr. Radzimski and then Mr. Merchant reported to Kenneth de Graffenried,
Yes, sir.
and you knew him to be the head of the NSC's Intelligence Directorate.
Correct.
And his assistant was named June Bartlett.
Correct.
Now, System 4 documents contained assigned numbers.
Yes.
How did you get those numbers when you prepared System 4 memoranda for Colonel North?
I would place a phone call to the Intelligence Directorate, and I would ask for a System 4 number, and they would rattle off a number, and I would type that on the document.
Again, you'd be requesting it from Radzimski's office.
Correct.
If you decided not to do the document, or Colonel North decided not to do the document, what became of the number?
I would place a phone call back to the same director, Jim Radzimski, and tell him that we no longer need the number.
And the number was returned to the security office.
Yes, sir.
You don't know if it was used on another document or not at that point.
No, I don't.
Once you finished a System 4 document, how was it typically sent out to the addressee, who in the cases we deal with is typically the National Security Advisor?
The package was compiled, and I Xeroxed a copy for my cron and my subject file and any other person that had a need to know for the package. I would take the original and either hand-deliver it across the street to the West Wing, where the National Security Advisor's office was, or I would have Jim Radzimski do it if I was being rushed, if I was in a hurry, or perhaps I would envelope it and seal it and indicate that it was classified and sensitive, indicate that it was System 4 document, and put it in the NSC mailbox.
So one copy at least went to the System Security Officer at the Intelligence Directorate,
Yes, a copy went there.
and then the original to the addressee.
Yes.
If it were not a crisis-type document or a hurry-up delivery, was the document supposed to be routed through the Executive Secretariat to the NSC, National Security Advisor?
Yes, sir.
But as you've testified, at times, if there was a rush, some urgency attached to it, either you or someone else would hand carry it directly to the West Wing to the National Security Advisor.
Correct.
We've seen System 4 memos prepared in Lieutenant Colonel North's office that from time to time contain the legend redo on it. You're familiar with that legend?
Yes, sir.
What did it mean?
It meant that a package had gone across the street, and someone along the line, either Executive Secretary or the Deputy or the National Security Advisor himself, had requested changes, and it came back to our office, and we incorporated those changes and indicated that the original was left as is with the changes, and a new package was done, and to indicate that it was changed, we would type in redo.
Redo would be put on the revised document, but the original document would be maintained in the file and not destroyed.
Yes, I think that's the normal practice, yes.
Another legend that we've seen on some of the System 4 memos is one which reads add-on, add-on. You're familiar with that legend.
Yes, sir.
What did it mean?
It meant that a package had gone across the street, and there was, it either had gone out to the agencies asking them to do something, and they had responded. Anyway, the idea is that there was new material to be added to an original package.
And when that material was added, you'd type add-on to the front page.
Correct.
But you'd again preserve the original document. It wouldn't be destroyed.
Yes.
So if there had originally been just a memo, say, from a staff member to the advisor, and then added to it was a proposed memo from the advisor to the president, you'd type add-on the front page.
Correct.
All right. Another legend we've seen is one that reads non-log, non-log. Is that a legend you're familiar with?
Yes, sir.
And what did it mean?
We use that in cases where it was so administrative it didn't even warrant being in System 1, or it was so sensitive that we didn't want to put it in System 4.
So this was a document that was being prepared and sent outside the system.
It was being sent to the National Security Advisor. It was not put into the system, series of systems.
It was outside the system.
Yes.
Was a copy of a non-log document sent to the System Security Officer at the NSC?
No, sir.
Now, looking again after that description at Exhibit 8 or Exhibit 8A, the so-called diversion memo, do you recall ever preparing a document before, aside from this document, before or after, which didn't contain a to or a from?
I believe we've done attachments to documents without a to or from. We've done issue-type papers before, yes.
But those were attachments to memos that were to somebody from somebody.
Yes.
And typically you also dated the memos you prepared as well, correct?
Normally, yes.
And this memo, as we have it, doesn't have a date on it, right?
Correct.
Can you account for the fact that it's undated?
It could have been that it went through so many reiterations that it was cumbersome to put a date on, or that for some reason maybe Colonel North had told me not to, or I just forgot.
Do you have a recollection of why there's no date on it?
No, I don't, sir.
Do you have a recollection of why there's no system number on it?
No, I don't.
Do you know or recall whether Colonel North told you that this document was to be handled as non-log or outside the system?
I believe he probably indicated that. I don't have a specific recollection.
Do you know why this document doesn't have the name of an addressee or a writer on it?
No, I don't, sir.
Is it possible, Ms. Hall, that this document is only part of a larger memo?
I have no idea, sir.
You don't recall.
I don't recall.
Now, you mentioned that you maintained subject and chronological files of memoranda.
Yes, sir.
Did you maintain those in your office?
Yes.
Where did you keep those files?
The Cron files in Suite 302 were placed in a cabinet that stood behind my desk and Barbara Brown's desk. The subject files were spread out through the office according to the different files.
Do you recall whether you made copies of this document, Exhibit 8 or 8A, and put copies in your subject and Cron files?
I know I would have. I don't have a specific recollection, no, but it would normally have been done. Yes.
Normally would have been your practice to put completed memos in those files.
Yes, and in the Cron and the subject file also.
Apart from this exhibit, Ms. Hall, do you have a recollection of typing any other documents which referred to the use of proceeds from the Iran arms sales on behalf of the Contras?
No, I don't, sir.
You recognize that this document, you've seen it before, contains such a reference,
Yes.
and you don't recall Colonel North making any particular mention of that when he dictated it to you or afterwards.
I don't have a specific recollection, no, sir.
Now, you knew, of course, and have testified, that Colonel North was involved in helping the Contra cause against the Sandinistas, correct?
Yes, sir.
You knew that Colonel North met not infrequently with Contra leaders, Messrs. Cruz, Rebello, and Calero.
Yes.
And you knew they communicated from time to time.
Yes, sir.
Did you know at any time while you worked for Colonel North that Colonel North was in any way involved in paying or otherwise transferring funds to any of those Contra leaders or Contra supporters?
I don't know that to be a fact. I do have a recollection of once seeing a spiral notebook Colonel North kept. I believe I saw him writing it once or twice and saw it on his desk, and it had names and dollar amounts in it.
This was a ledger that you saw Colonel North writing in his office?
Yes, sir.
Just describe what it looked like, please.
The way I remember it, it was very similar to something you might buy in a Hallmark card store. It was a manila-colored spiral square type calendar, and I believe, my recollection is right, that he flipped to the back of it where they allow you to write notes, and that's where the ledger was kept.
Where did you see that ledger?
The last time I remember really seeing it, I believe, is in room 392.
Which would have been before May 1986.
Yes, sir.
You saw Colonel North writing in the ledger?
I believe so, sir.
And you remember seeing a page open with names and columns on it?
Yes.
Do you recall any of the names?
I don't have a specific recollection, no, sir.
Do you have any recollection?
My feeling or my assumption is that it had to do with Central America.
The Contras?
Yes.
Can you recall any specific name that was on that ledger?
I don't recall. I don't have a picture of the ledger in my mind, sir. But I would say that it probably had Calero and Cruz and others on it.
You saw numbers?
Yes, sir.
Did you understand these based on what you saw to be dollar amounts?
Yes, sir.
Do you recall what the magnitude was of any of those dollar amounts?
No, I don't, sir.
No recollection of that whatsoever?
No, sir. I'd like to add that I did not open the notebook at any time or question Colonel North on that notebook. I merely was walking in the office and noticed that the notebook was there. I did not take any hard looks at it.
Do you know where Colonel North kept that ledger or notebook?
I don't recall, sir, not really.
Did he
I
ever-
think that he might have kept it to the right of his old desk in 392 where some drawers.
In any event, he never asked you to make any entries in it or file it?
No, sir.
And you never saw it again after you moved from the old office to Suite 302?
I don't recall, sir.
Now,
I don't recall seeing it after 392.
you recall hearing rumors around your office that Colonel North kept cash in Suite 302 or Suite 392?
Yes, sir.
Were those fairly widespread stories?
I think they were within office.
And what do you recall hearing?
I don't have a specific recollection. I just have a feeling of that. Just a moment, sir. As you know, sir, you have brought to my attention the fact that I was given 3 traveler's checks.
We'll get to that.
Okay, well, it's hard for me to explain to you why I had this feeling, and that would help in this case.
We'll go to the traveler's checks in 1 second. Let me just ask whether you ever asked Colonel North about any of the stories you heard concerning the possibility that he kept cash in the office.
Absolutely not.
Do you know whether he was familiar with those stories?
I would assume so, yes.
Did you ever hear him make a statement of anger or denial about such stories being passed around the office?
No, sir.
And did you have the impression that the stories were true?
Yes, sir.
Now, as you referred to moments ago, I had asked you at one point during our interviews whether you had ever received or borrowed cash from Colonel North. And in one of our early interviews, you had recalled an occasion when you thought you had borrowed some $20 from him, correct?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
And then subsequently, the committees came into the possession of certain documents, including traveler's checks, which I showed you, and copies of which now appear as Exhibit 7 in your binder. Do you recall that?
Yes, sir.
Now, having looked at those traveler's checks during our interviews, and you see them again now, it's FH7. Until I showed you the traveler's checks, you did not recall this event. Is that correct, Ms. Hall?
Yes, sir.
Having seen the traveler's checks, copies of which are on Exhibit 7, you recognize your signature in both places on the 3 checks.
Yes, sir.
3 checks totaling $60, each for $20.
Yes, sir.
They're dated June 21, June 22, and June 23 of 1985. And looking at the calendar, we established that was a weekend, beginning with Friday, June 21.
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, with those facts, what do you recall about these checks and your obtaining them from Colonel North?
I recall that June 21st was a Friday, and we were working late, and I was planning a weekend to the beach, but yet the banks had closed, and I didn't have any cash to go to the beach with. And I recall that I asked Colonel North to borrow some money. At the time, I thought it was $20. It appears now that I had asked for $60. And Colonel North obviously handed me $60 in traveler's checks. Outside at my desk and had asked him earlier for them, and maybe gone back in and he already had them out. I just don't recall where he got them from.
You have no recollection of whether they were on his desk or whether he took out a wad of traveler's checks or went to a safe?
No, sir.
Now, when he handed you the checks, did he say anything?
My recollection is that he said, make sure you return, pay back the money, it's not mine.
Referring to the traveler's checks.
Correct.
You cashed them that weekend as indicated at a gas station, a market, and a beach package store,
Yes.
and you subsequently repaid Colonel North.
Yes, sir.
Was there ever any other occasion when you saw Colonel North with traveler's checks or saw Colonel North with traveler's checks?
I don't recall, sir, no. I don't believe I've ever seen him with traveler's checks.
Any other occasion on which you borrowed money from Colonel North?
No.
When Colonel North gave you the checks, or during the ensuing weekend, did you happen to notice that they were drawn on a bank in Central America?
At the time, yes, sir.
Did you find that curious?
I found it unusual.
And did you ask Colonel North how he happened to have traveler's checks that were drawn on a Central American bank?
No, I didn't, sir. It was my policy not to ask questions. It was just something.
Did you ask Colonel North where he got the traveler's checks from?
No, sir.
And he didn't volunteer any of that information?
No, sir.
Okay. Now, can you recall another incident sometime after June of 1986, which also adds to your impression that Colonel North... Do you recall where Colonel North physically took the checks from?
No, I don't, sir.
Or did he get them from his desk, from his pocket, from one of the safes?
I don't recall, sir. I don't believe I was present in the room when he gave them to me. I think I would have remembered.
Well, where do you think he was, and where were you when he went to get the checks?
I would have to say that I was probably outside at my desk and had asked him earlier for them, and maybe gone back in and he already had them out. I just don't recall where he got them from.
You have no recollection of whether they were on his desk or whether he took out a wad of traveler's checks or went to a safe?
No, sir.
Now, when he handed you the checks, did he say anything?
My recollection is that he said, make sure you return, pay back the money, it's not mine.
Referring to the traveler's checks.
Correct.
You cashed them that weekend as indicated at a gas station, a market, and a beach package store,
Yes.
and you subsequently repaid Colonel North.
Yes, sir.
Was there ever any other occasion when you saw Colonel North with traveler's checks or saw Colonel North with traveler's checks?
I don't recall, sir, no. I don't believe I've ever seen him with traveler's checks.
Any other occasion on which you borrowed money from Colonel North?
No.
When Colonel North gave you the checks, or during the ensuing weekend, did you happen to notice that they were drawn on a bank in Central America?
At the time, yes, sir.
Did you find that curious?
I found it unusual.
And did you ask Colonel North how he happened to have traveler's checks that were drawn on a Central American bank?
No, I didn't, sir. It was my policy not to ask questions. It was just something.
Did you ask Colonel North where he got the traveler's checks from?
No, sir.
And he didn't volunteer any of that information?
No, sir.
Okay. Now, can you recall another incident sometime after June of 1986, which also adds to your impression that Colonel North was dealing to some extent with cash?
I'm sorry, can you repeat? I'm
Well,
sorry.
let me take it this way. Do you recall a gentleman called Father Dowling, Father Tom Dowling?
Yes, sir.
Who did you understand Father Dowling to be?
I understood him to be a priest, and I think that he dealt with Colonel North regarding Central America.
You thought that Father Dowling was a priest based on his clerical garb that he wore?
Correct.
Did Colonel North ever tell you that he was a priest?
No, but I have seen the father in his clerical garb before.
And you knew him as somebody who had an interest in Central America?
Yes, sir.
He was a frequent caller at the office?
I would say so, yes.
Do you recall that Colonel North arranged a photo opportunity for Father Dowling and another priest in June of 1986, a photo opportunity with the President?
Yes, sir.
Now, the other priest, Mr. Chairman, with the committee's permission, we'll refer to as Father Z because the name is protected and we've been asked to use that formulation. Now, Father Z is someone you associated with Father Dowling as well, correct?
Yes, sir.
And he was a Nicaraguan priest?
Yes, sir.
And he too joined Father Dowling at the photo opportunity that Colonel North set up in June of 1986 with the President.
Yes, sir.
Sometime following that event, when you saw Father Dowling, Father Z, and Colonel North, do you recall receiving a telephone call from Father Dowling who was upset about a matter?
Yes, sir. He had called a couple times, I believe, and expressed that Mr. Z had not received what he was waiting for. And I think the last time I remember Father Dowling calling, he was very desperate, and Colonel North happened to be leaving the office at the time, and I expressed to him Father Dowling's desperation, and he said, get Rich Miller on the phone and make sure that he takes care of that. And Colonel North left. I placed a call to Rich Miller and expressed the fact that Father Dowling had called and that Father Z had not received what he was expecting.
And did you associate that request and that event with a transfer of funds?
That was my association.
based on something that was said to you on the phone by Father Dowling?
Yes, sir.
All right, so from those events, that call, the traveler's checks, and the ledger, you formed the impression that Colonel North was dealing to some extent with money and it related to the Contras.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to turn now to the Iran matter and the events of November, but before we do, I want to clear up one other point that's been raised before the committees. Do you remember a time in or about early June of 1986 when you were asked by Colonel North to type an account number on a card?
Yes, sir.
And do you recall that Assistant Secretary Elliot Abrams was present at that time?
I thought that it was someone else, but I now realize that it was Secretary Abrams, yes.
Your best recollection now is that Secretary Abrams was present.
Yes, sir.
This was in your office at Suite 302?
Yes, sir.
And would you describe, please, for the committees, what happened?
I was sitting at my desk. Colonel North passed me a piece of paper with an account number on it and asked me to type it. I pulled out a 3x5 index card, typed what I saw, and returned the slip of paper that he had given me and the card.
To Colonel North?
Yes.
And as far as you know, you typed on the card precisely the account number which Colonel North gave you on the slip of paper?
Yes, sir.
And you understand from subsequent events that that is the account number which has come into controversy in connection with a contribution from Brunei?
Yes, sir.
When you handed the paper, and after you handed the paper and the card with the number to Colonel North, typed as you saw the number on the slip, that was the last time you saw or heard about that?
Yes, sir.
Now turning to the events, Ms. Hall, of November 1986, you recall that early in the month of November, the foreign press broke the story about the Iran initiative.
Yes, sir.
And shortly thereafter, you were aware that the NSC staff was working on preparing a chronology of events relevant to the Iran initiative.
Yes, sir.
What did you learn about the preparation of that chronology at the time?
Colonel North was preparing it, I assume at the direction of the National Security Advisor, and I don't know who else, to set the record straight.
Did you hear any discussions of events to be put in or left out of that chronology?
I don't recall, no.
You recall participating to the extent of helping type the various drafts of the chronology?
Yes, sir.
And you recall also an occasion when Mr. McFarland came into your office during the preparation of the chronologies
Yes, sir.
and typed an insert using the prof's machine in Colonel North's inside office?
Yes, sir.
Did anyone tell you specifically what the purpose of these Iran chronologies was?
I don't recall, sir.
Now, you recall that November 21st was a Friday in 1986.
Yes, sir.
Would you turn to Exhibit FH9? The second page of the exhibit has Colonel North's calendar entries for that day. And you see two references on that day, Friday, November 21, to Michael Ledeen.
Yes, sir.
Do you recall whether Mr. Ledeen was in the office on that day?
My recollection is that, well, the appointment that shows at 11 o'clock, I believe, with Mr. McFarland, Mr. Ledeen, was not held in our office. I did not know at the time where the meeting was held. The later meeting at 2:30, I believe that Michael probably came to the office. That's my recollection.
Do you recall what Mr. Ledeen did in the office on that day?
I have no idea, sir.
Do you know what was discussed at the earlier meeting outside of the office among Messrs. McFarland, Ledeen, and North?
I have no idea, sir.
Now, there's also an entry on the calendar for November 21 at 5:30, Tom Green.
Yes, sir.
Do you recall whether Mr. Green was in the office on that day at or about that time?
I don't believe he was, sir. I think he picked up Colonel North outside the office.
Did you know who Tom Green was as of November 21, 1986?
I knew that Tom Green was a lawyer.
And had you had occasion to place calls to him and take calls from him while you were working for Colonel North?
Yes, sir.
And did such calls occur both before and after May of 1986?
Yes, sir.
Did you know what Colonel North's business was with Mr. Green on any of those occasions?
No, I didn't, sir.
Did you know whether Mr. Green was representing Colonel North at any time up to November 21, 1986?
No, I didn't.
You knew he was a lawyer, Tom Green.
Yes?
Did you know who he was a lawyer for?
No?
Now, sometime during the afternoon on Friday, November 21, 1986, did Colonel North hand you several documents and ask you to make changes?
Yes, sir.
Would you describe generally what he handed to you and what he asked you to do?
I was sitting at my desk, and he came outside his office and handed me 3 or 4 original System 4 packages with changes indicated on them, I believe in red or blue ink, I'm not sure, and asked me to make the changes, and I did so.
These were handwritten changes,
Yes, sir.
and they were handwritten changes on original System 4 documents.
Yes, sir.
And so far as you knew, where had those original System 4 documents been up until that point?
I have no idea, sir.
Did you recognize them as completed documents?
Yes, sir.
So that ordinarily, those documents would have been in the original files maintained by the System 4 security officer right next door to your office, correct?
Yes, sir.
Who by that time in November was Brian Merchant.
Yes, sir.
Did you recognize the handwriting on the original System 4 documents that Colonel North gave you?
Yes, sir.
Whose handwriting was it?
Colonel Norris.
Up until that time, Ms. Hall, had you ever been asked by Colonel North or anyone else to make changes to original, completed System 4 documents?
I don't believe so, sir.
Did you make the changes that Colonel North indicated?
Yes.
And did you destroy the marked up originals that Colonel North gave you with the changes written in?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Did Colonel North ask you to destroy those marked up originals?
I don't know if he told me to destroy them or if I just destroyed them on my own initiative.
You understood from the circumstances exactly what you were expected to do.
Yes, sir.
Now, there were various action lines on these memos, which we'll review, for approve or disapprove check marks, correct?
Yes, sir.
And once you revised or altered the documents and came up with altered originals, did you go back and check those boxes as indicated?
Yes, I asked Colonel North what he wanted me to do, and he said just go ahead and check them. And I checked them as I thought that they reflected the other originals.
And Colonel North made it a practice usually of putting his initial N on the front of documents, correct?
Yes, sir.
And did you put his N on each of the altered originals which you prepared?
Yes, sir.
Now, you'll recall that when we spoke, in the absence of the documents, you could not remember the specific documents or the specific changes that you made.
That's right, sir.
Did you pay attention to any of those changes when Colonel North handed you the documents and said, here, make these changes?
No, I didn't.
Did you ask Colonel North why he wanted you to make those changes?
No, I didn't.
Did you read the changes that he made?
No, I didn't.
Did you appreciate the significance of the changes that Colonel North was asking you to make to those original System 4 documents?
No, I didn't.
Weren't you curious?
It was a policy of mine not to ask questions and just to follow instructions. I believed in Colonel North and what he was doing. I had no right to question him.
And so you took the original documents and made the changes that Colonel North told you to make.
Yes, I did.
And again, absent anything else, you could not recall what those documents were by substance or what the changes were that Colonel North asked you to make.
That's correct.
But you did recall one or so of the System 4 numbers that were on the documents,
I believe I
correct?
recalled a System 4 number, yes.
And we then subsequently found a handwritten note which we showed you containing System 4 numbers. You recall that?
Yes.
Would you look at FH Exhibit 1? Now, FH Exhibit 1, Ms. Hall, is a note which was produced to us by the White House, and it contains various System 4 numbers.
Yes.
That is the note we showed you that helped refresh your recollection and indeed lead us to copies of the altered documents, correct?
Yes, sir.
Do you recognize whose handwriting that note is in?
Mr. McFarland's?
Do you recall when you first saw this handwritten note by Mr. McFarland, FH Exhibit 1?
I believe it was in the summer of 1985.
And where did you see it?
It was taped to the ledge of Colonel North's desk in his suite 392.
Taped to the ledge near his computer terminal?
Yes, sir.
And do you associate first seeing FH1 with the time that congressional inquiries were underway into Colonel North's activities on behalf of the Contras?
Yes, sir.
You were familiar at the time that Congressman Hamilton and Congressman Barnes had made such inquiries?
Yes, sir.
Do you recall that documents were being pulled from System 4 files around that time as part of the response to the inquiry?
I don't recall, sir, no.
But you do associate this list of numbers by Mr. McFarland with those inquiries?
Yes.
The sheet of handwritten numbers remained taped to Colonel North's desk until the time you moved in May 1986?
Yes.
By the way, was the circle around the number 401214 at the time you first saw the note?
I don't believe so, sir.
Was the word cover on the note?
Yes.
And the inscription on the right below, 19, either Jan or June, Yediot, Aranot, do you recall seeing that when it was typed to the desk?
No, sir.
Do you know what that note refers to?
No, I don't, sir.
Do you recognize it as the name of an Israeli newspaper?
No, I don't.
So you saw the list just with the numbers and the word cover.
Yes, sir.
Now, would you take a look at Fawn Hall Exhibit 1A? This is another version of the same note with some text at the bottom which I'll read into the record. All originals attached except 401214. According to computer, all copies of 401214 were destroyed. Please return these documents to me when you have finished. Brian. Do you recognize that handwriting?
I don't recognize the handwriting, sir, but the name I associate with Brian Merchant, the System 4 keeper.
Okay. There is another handwritten note at the bottom which reads, signed out to Ollie North, J.B. Do you recognize that handwriting?
Again, I do not recognize the handwriting. JB I associate with June Bartlett, Kindergraff and Reed's secretary.
And based on this note, it appears that the documents were at least first requested, if not signed out, on November 21, 1986, which is the date that you were handed original System 4 documents to alter, correct?
Yes, sir.
You did not see this note at the bottom prior to our interviews.
That's right.
Now, Ms. Hall, there was another way that you were able to help us identify the altered and the unaltered documents, and I'd like you to please turn to FH Exhibit 2. That exhibit is on a letterhead which reads National Security Council in the center, and over on the left it reads Memorandum, correct?
Yes.
That form of letterhead was in use during 1985, correct?
Yes, sir.
Was that form of letterhead discontinued by 1986?
Yes, sir.
Now would you take a look at Fawn Hall Exhibit 2A? And you'll see that that is on a letterhead which doesn't have the word memorandum, correct?
Yes.
And in the center, it not only reads National Security Council, but it also contains Washington, D.C. and the zip code, right?
Yes.
That form of paper was in use at the NSC in 1985, was it not?
Yes, it was.
but never for memos from the staff to the National Security Advisor.
I don't
correct?
believe it was supposed to be used for that purpose, no.
So that in 1985, you would not have prepared a memo such as Exhibit 2A on that National Security Council letterhead.
That's correct.
You would have prepared it on the form of letterhead that we saw on Exhibit 2.
Yes.
But by 1986, November 1986, when you were asked to make altered versions of certain documents, that memorandum letterhead had been discontinued, correct?
Yes.
So that all you had was the letterhead we see on Exhibit 2A, National Security Council, Washington, D.C.,
Yes.
which indicates to you that that document wasn't prepared in 1985.
Yes.
Now, I'd like to go through the documents. Let's begin, if we may, Ms. Hall, with Exhibit FH2, which is a memorandum for Mr. McFarland from Lieutenant Colonel North, dated February 6, 1985, and the subject is Nicaraguan arms shipments. You have that document before you?
Yes, I do.
We also have a blow-up of the document on the wall to the right. You notice the System 4 number is 402003, correct?
Yes.
And that is one of the numbers which appears on the handwritten list, FH Exhibit 1.
Yes.
Now, this document was prepared originally on or about February 6, 1985, as the date indicates. And you have no independent recollection, as we've established, of what the document contained then and what changes were made in the document on November 21, 1986.
That's correct.
Well, let's then review the document for the committee, and let me explain the coloring on the documents as they've been put up. On the original document, material that's deleted is highlighted in blue ink. On what we believe to be the altered version of the document, material that was put in that did not appear on the original document is highlighted in orange. Now, going through Exhibit 2, Exhibit 2 in its original form, where the blue highlighting occurs, was a memorandum from Lieutenant Colonel North to Mr. McFarland, in which he advised that a Nicaraguan merchant ship was unloading cargo in Asia, and in the blacked out portion was taking on lethal cargo, weapons, for the Contras at a certain other spot in the east. Colonel North then goes on, as you see at the bottom of page 1 of Exhibit 2, to present 3 options to Mr. McFarland for dealing with that vessel. He says that the shipment of weapons could be seized and the weapons could be delivered to the Nicaraguan resistance, or he says the ship could be sunk, or he says publicity could be given to the shipment and the parties involved in order to prevent the delivery that way. If we then turn to the second page of Exhibit 2, Colonel North provides Mr. McFarland additional details concerning the possibility of having Mr. Calero and his people assist in some way with preventing the delivery of those weapons to Nicaragua. And the memorandum concludes with a recommendation that Mr. McFarland authorize Mr. Calero to be provided with information on this ship and to be approached on the matter of seizing or sinking it. Beneath that, there is a handwritten notation, and Ms. Hall, do you recognize that as Admiral Poindexter's writing?
Yes, I do.
The notation in Admiral Poindexter's writing reads, "We need to take action to make sure the ship does not arrive in Nicaragua." Now, Ms. Hall, before we go to the other version of Exhibit 2, once you made the changes and you destroyed the marked up originals. What were you going to do with the altered originals?
The altered originals I plan to Xerox and replace the cron copy and the subject file copy, and then return the original altered document to the System 4 keeper.
All right. At that time, you recognized that you had your own copies in your subject and cron files in the office of the same documents that Colonel North was asking you to change, right?
Yes, sir.
So to complete the alteration process and to make it effective, you knew you had to substitute the new altered original for the copies that were in your files and get rid of those copies, right?
Yes, sir.
And to complete the process finally, you understood that you had to then get the altered original back to Mr. Merchant's shop to be refiled, right?
Yes, sir.
Did you ever get past the step of destroying the originals that Colonel North had marked up?
I destroyed the originals, made the changes, assembled the packages, began to Xerox them, and I was stopped in the process by what I now think is probably the shredding incident.
Which we'll get to. In any event, you were interrupted while you were making copies or endeavoring to make copies of the documents, the altered originals, correct?
Yes.
So you never had the opportunity to get out of your files the copies of the unaltered documents,
Yes, sir.
or to get the altered originals back to the security office,
Yes.
which accounts for why 2 copies of each document were found ultimately in the files.
Yes.
Now, having gone through Exhibit 2, we'll take a look at FH Exhibit 2A. And you'll notice that bears the same System 4 number as Exhibit 2, correct? 402003, right?
Yes, sir.
But now that 2-page memo concerning the ship Monimbo and its proposed weapons delivery to Nicaragua has been shrunk to a 1-page memo, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that memo deletes all discussion of the 3 options that Colonel North had put to McFarland: sink, seize, or publicize, right?
Yes, sir.
And what is inserted in place of any of those options or any discussion of the Contras helping with an operation to seize the ship is a recommendation, in effect, to declassify the information that Colonel North had about the ship so it could be printed in the overseas news media.
Yes.
And we believe this to be one of the documents that you were asked to prepare on November 21, correct, Ms. Hall?
Yes.
Again, it is on letterhead that you would not have been using for such a memo in 1985.
Yes, sir.
And that appears to be your N next to Oliver North's name.
Yes, sir.
Now, I notice that the approve box in Exhibit 2A is checked. There is no check on the approve line in Exhibit 2, the original of the memo. Do you have any recollection of whether you were asked specifically to check the approved box on 2A?
I believe that, I don't have a specific recollection. I believe that I probably saw Admiral Poindexter's handwriting and realized I couldn't exactly redo that and decided just to check the approve line, which is similar to his comment.
And again, if you had been able to finish the process, what the files would have been left with is what we see as Exhibit 2A. There would have been no Exhibit 2, including no handwritten notation by Admiral Poindexter.
That's correct.
Let's turn then, if we may, to the next document, which is FH Exhibit 3. That document bears the System 4 number 400215. And again, Ms. Hall, that is one of the numbers on the McFarland handwritten list, Exhibit 1, is it not?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
This was a document prepared originally on or about March 5, 1985. It is a memo from Colonel North to Mr. McFarland, and it pertains to aid to the Nicaraguan resistance from a certain Central American country, the name of which has been deleted from the unclassified version of this memo. Now, in this memo, as we see from reading it, Colonel North proposes to Mr. McFarland that Mr. McFarland send a memorandum to the Secretary of State, to the Secretary of Defense, to the Director of Central Intelligence, and to the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, asking for their views on increased U.S. assistance to this Central American country, and proposing that such increased assistance be given. Colonel North then goes on in Exhibit 3 to say to Mr. McFarland that the real purpose of the proposed memo to the cabinet officers would be to find a way to compensate the Central American country for the extraordinary assistance that that country had been furnishing to the Nicaraguan freedom fighters by facilitating the delivery of lethal assistance, weapons, through the provision of false end-user certificates. And Colonel North goes on to point out to Mr. McFarland on page 2 of Exhibit 3 that the proposed memo to the senior cabinet officials does not refer to any of those arrangements which had been made by the Central American country to help the freedom fighters. The recommendation is that Mr. McFarland sign the proposed memo to the senior cabinet officers and send it along, a memo which contained, as Colonel North put it, no reference to the real purpose of the recommendation. And then, as you'll see, there were various attachments, the first being the proposed memo to the secretaries, the DCI, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the second being copies of the false end-user certificates, and the third being a wish list of military equipment requirements for the Contras, which Colonel North also refers to in his memo to Mr. McFarland. And again, as far as you know, Ms. Hall, you would have prepared this document, that is, typed it for Colonel North back in March of 1985.
Yes, sir.
Now let's look then at Exhibit FH3A. It bears the same System 4 number as Exhibit 3, does it not? 400215?
Yes, sir.
Only it's on the letterhead that you wouldn't have used in 1985, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that looks like your N next to Oliver North's name.
Yes, sir.
The subject is the same subject as Exhibit 3 in its 1985 manifestation, namely aid to the Nicaraguan resistance by the same unidentified here Central American country. Only now that two-page memo has been reduced to 2 paragraphs, the first of which tells Mr. McFarland that there is a proposed memo to the senior cabinet members asking for their views on assistance, increased assistance to the Central American country, and the second of which simply says that your memo, Mr. McFarland, also urges that we provide the assistance, and the approved box is checked. And again, you recall that it would have been you who checked the approved box on Exhibit 3A.
Yes, sir.
Now, I notice that Exhibit 3A, although it no longer refers in text to the real purpose of the attached memo or to the end-user certificates, continues to attach or to indicate an attachment of end-user certificates and the wish list of weapons for the Contras, all reference to which had been deleted from the memo itself, correct?
Yes, sir.
We've talked about that. Can you account for why the end-user certificates and the military equipment wish list were left in when the references to them were the object of Colonel North's deletions?
All I can say is it emphasizes the fact that I didn't read the changes that were being made, or else I would have realized to remove the attachments, and it also emphasizes the fact that Colonel North, to my recollection, did not give me any further instructions other than to change them.
You were uneasy while you were making these changes, weren't you?
I felt a little bit of uneasiness when he asked me to do it, but again, as I've stated, I believe in Colonel North, and I know that there must have been a good reason why he was asking me to do this, and I did as I was told.
Did you know at the time that Colonel North asked you to do this that the President of the United States had asked the Attorney General to make an inquiry into the facts concerning the delivery and sale of American weapons to Iran?
I did not recall that, no.
Did Colonel North mention to you that he knew the Attorney General had been asked to undertake that assignment and would be coming to the office to review documents, or that his representatives would be coming the very next morning?
No, sir.
You did not know any of those things when you made the changes that Colonel North requested, right?
No, sir.
While you were making the changes, did anybody come over to your desk?
Yes, sir.
Who was that?
Commander Craig Coy.
And what did you do when Commander Coy approached your desk while you were altering the documents?
I turned the documents over, face down.
Why?
I felt that it was my policy not to expose or talk about what I was doing, and I felt that I didn't know whether Colonel North had shared with Commander Coy what he was doing, and I felt that it wasn't my place to show Commander Coy what I was doing.
You weren't totally comfortable with what you were doing, were you, Miss Hall?
I would say that I wasn't totally comfortable, yes. But as I've said before, I believe that Colonel North had a good reason for doing what he was doing, and I'm not going to question that.
He didn't tell you what that reason was?
No, he didn't.
Let's take a look now at Exhibit FH4. FH4 is a memorandum dated March 16, 1985, from Colonel North to Mr. McFarland. It contains the System 4 number 400246, and that again, Ms. Hall, is another one of the document numbers appearing on the McFarland list.
Yes, sir.
All right. This document was typed on or about March 16, 1985, and its subject is fallback plan for the Nicaraguan resistance. Now, the document, as it appeared on March 16, 1985, or at least as we have it, consisted of 3 pages. The first page of which was a cover memorandum from Colonel North, in which he said that a fallback plan had been developed, that plan which is laid out on the second 2 pages, a fallback plan to aid the Nicaraguan resistance on the assumption that the Congress decided not to rescind the restrictions on Contra aid that were then in force. Colonel North goes on to tell Mr. McFarland that secrecy for the plan, in his words, is paramount, and that the other key to the plan is that the present donors continue their relationship with the resistance beyond the current funding figure. The recommendation that Colonel North makes to Mr. McFarland is that if Senators Durenberger and Lugar indicate that there is an unwillingness on the part of Congress to support resumption of full United States government aid to the Nicaraguan resistance, then Mr. McFarland ought to discuss this fallback plan with the Secretary of State. Now, if you look at the second page of the exhibit, Exhibit 4, Colonel North begins laying out there, and continues on the page after, precisely what he proposes as that fallback option. And very briefly, the Colonel tells Mr. McFarland that the funding which is then being provided by the current donors would be sufficient to carry the resistance until October, provided that additional monies were raised for non-military supplies. Colonel North's proposal to raise that money is that the President of the United States, instead of returning to the Congress for assistance as contemplated by the statute then in force, that instead of doing that, the President make a sudden and dramatic appeal over nationwide television to the citizens of the United States, asking them to contribute to the Nicaraguan resistance, correct? And he proposes that there be established a non-profit, tax-exempt organization for that purpose, that the Contra leaders be informed, and that the President's speech be conceived and put together in total secrecy. Would you now take a look at Exhibit 4A? Exhibit 4A bears the same System 4 number as Exhibit 4, 400246, only this one reduces what was a 3-page memorandum to a 1-paragraph memorandum. And in that paragraph, Colonel North has deleted all reference to any fallback plan and says instead that Congress seems reluctant to rescind the aid restrictions and that there therefore is a need to develop a fallback plan for supporting the resistance. And he states that the best fallback we have is to stress that while President Reagan is unwilling to use U.S. troops in Nicaragua, all available intelligence supports the realization that we will have to in the 1990s if there is not a democratic outcome now. You've checked the approve box on that document, and this too is one of the documents that we believe you prepared at Colonel North's request on November 21, correct?
Yes, sir.
Let's turn then to Exhibit 5. Exhibit 5 bears the System 4 number 402007, which you recognize as another of the numbers on Mr. McFarland's list, correct?
Yes, sir.
That document, as prepared on April 11, 1985, contained a discussion of FDN military operations, which had been made possible by funding that had been provided through the donors after the cutoff of American aid by the Congress. On page 2, Colonel North concludes that the money on hand will be insufficient to enable the resistance to grow to a larger force than it had achieved unless efforts were made to seek additional funds of $15 to $20 million from the current donors. By the way, Ms. Hall, did Colonel North ever identify to you or describe to you who he meant by the present donors or the current donors in these memoranda?
No, he didn't.
In any event, Colonel North recommends that those donors be approached for more aid, and on page 3 of the memo, that recommendation is stated succinctly. He attaches to the memo a list of expenditures and outlays by the resistance. Now, let's compare that document, Exhibit 5, with Exhibit FH 5A. And as we look at those pages, in general, information that seems to have been acquired actively by Colonel North has been deleted, and instead there are phrases such as, according to information they, the resistance, have given us. There's a more passive tense used when describing the type of knowledge that Colonel North had, but the most dramatic change on the document comes at the end. All references to the present donors or funding by the present donors have been deleted from the document, and instead of making a recommendation that the current donors be approached for increased aid, the recommendation is that Congress be approached for increased aid. The specific recommendation then at the very end of the memo on page 3 is, quote, that you brief the President on the current situation and urge concerted action on immediate congressional approval of a $14 million CIA supplemental and a $75 to $100 million for the next fiscal year. And again, you've checked the approve box on page 3 of that memo.
Yes, sir.
Now, I won't ask that Exhibit 5B be put up, but if you'll turn to it in your book, you'll see that Exhibit 5B is a memo dated May 1, 1985, containing the System 4 number 400453, which is another number that was on the McFarland list, correct?
Yes, sir.
And from comparing it, although it is dated May 1, 1985, it appears to be the same as the altered version of the April document, namely Exhibit 4A, correct? Or 5A, I'm sorry.
Yes, sir.
And do you have any recollection of why the document was prepared with a date of May 1 as well as a date of April 11?
I think I've said it's a possibility that the memorandum went across the street and was revised or asked to be redone in May.
But you have no specific recollection.
No, I don't.
And I should advise you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, that we have not, at this point, located a May 1, 1985 unaltered document. The only document we've been able to find so far is the one which appears as Exhibit FH5B, which is the same as the altered April document. The circle around 401214 for the information of the committee is explained by the note on FH Exhibit 2. At the time that these documents were requested, that is FH Exhibit 1A, at the time the original System 4 documents were requested back in 1986 from the security officer, he could not locate a 1985 document that contained 401214 as the system number. He believed that those documents had been destroyed, and he so advised on his note. Subsequently, during the course of this investigation, Mr. Chairman, a document bearing that number was located in the files of the NSC, except it was a 1984 memorandum. When the documents had been requested, the security officer did not look in the 1984 files. That document is a December 4, 1984 memo from Colonel North to Mr. McFarland, which has been previously marked in this hearing as Gaston Seeger Exhibit 1, and it is the memo in which Colonel North recounts a meeting at the Cosmos Club with a military representative of country number 4. Now that accounts for all the documents, Ms. Hall, that were listed on McFarland's handwritten note. During the course of our work, however, we came upon another document, you'll recall, that we showed you, which appears also to have been altered. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Would you look then at Exhibit 6? Exhibit 6 is a document dated May 31, 1985, system number 400564, which does not appear on the McFarland handwritten list, and it is entitled The Nicaraguan Resistance Near-Term Outlook from North to McFarland. The document contains, as its title suggests, a description by North of how the Nicaraguan resistance is doing at that time and what its prospects are. On the last page of the document, directly before the recommendation, the sentence appears, "The only portion of current activity which will be sustained as it has since last June will be the delivery of lethal supplies." You see that on the document?
Yes.
Would you now turn to Exhibit 6A? Bears the same System 4 security number, the same date, and you'll notice that the first page is on the letterhead that was in use in 1985 but not in 1986. Correct, Ms. Hall?
Yes, sir.
And we've compared it. The first 2 pages of Exhibit 6A are identical to the first 2 pages of Exhibit 6. The changes come on the last page. And the striking change on the last page is that the sentence which I read, which refers to lethal assistance, has been deleted, correct?
Yes, sir.
And there is also a sentence higher on the page in the first full paragraph, which has been changed. On the original of the document, that sentence refers to a series of meetings with Rivera and his representatives, and then subsequent meetings with another Contra leader named Stedman Fagoth. In 6A, the reference is simply to a series of meetings with Stedman Fagoth and nothing to do with the meeting Rivera, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, do you have any recollection, Ms. Hall, of when you revised this document?
I don't have an independent recollection, but I know from our talks that I think we've determined that it was probably done in '85 when the letterhead was still in existence.
And I've refreshed you with Mr. McFarland's testimony at this hearing, page 189, the May 11 transcript, in which he described reviewing various documents with Colonel North in the late fall or in the late summer or early fall of 1985 in connection with the congressional inquiries, right?
Yes, sir.
And he was describing, talking to Colonel North about the documents being unclear, that Colonel North's intent might be misread, and Mr. McFarland testified that he, Colonel North, just said, quote, "You are misreading my intent, and I can make it reflect what I have said if this is ambiguous to you." And I, that's Mr. McFarland, said, "All right, do that." Continuing, within the matter of a day or two, he, Colonel North, returned to my office, and he had 2 single pages. One of them was the same text, or close to it, of the first page of a memorandum. As far as we've been able to tell, Ms. Hall, the first page of 6A is the same as the first page of 6, correct?
Yes.
Mr. McFarland continued that the other piece of paper Mr. North returned with was the last page of a memorandum. And the last page of 6A is where we found the changes, correct?
Yes, sir.
And so from hearing that testimony, your general recollection, although you don't recall independently, is that this document probably was changed around the fall of 1985 or sometime thereafter,
Yes, sir.
but not on November 21, 1986.
Yes, sir.
That completes the testimony on those documents. Now, Ms. Hall, on the same day as you were asked to make the changes that we've reviewed in 1986, November 21, you said before that your work on those documents probably was interrupted by the shredding, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you do recall that shredding of documents occurred in Suite 302 on that day.
Yes, sir.
Tell us how it began and when it began.
To the best of my recollection, it was early evening. I don't have a clear recollection of how it started. I believe that Colonel North probably opened the 5-drawer safe and began to pull items from it, and I joined him in an effort so that he would not have to just wasting his time shredding. And as he pulled documents from each drawer and placed them on top of the shredder, I inserted them into the shredder. At the same time, I asked him if I could go ahead and shred the prof's notes and phone logs, and he acknowledged that I should go ahead and do that, and I did so.
Approximately what time did this begin on November 21?
My recollection is early evening, 5, 6, 7.
Who else was in the office at that time apart from you and Colonel North?
I remember Colonel Bob Earl being in the office, and I believe Jock Sharfin, who shared the suite with us upstairs, he had an office in the middle, was probably running in and out.
To your knowledge, did Mr. Sharfin observe any of the shredding?
No.
And he did not participate in that activity, correct?
That's correct, sir.
Did Colonel Earl participate in the shredding activity?
As I recall, Colonel Earl's participation was that of, I recall him in the office carrying files, and my assumption was that Colonel North probably had engaged him in pulling documents, and my recollection is that he passed me the KL-43 messages, which I have said that were also shredded.
Colonel Earl passed you those messages to shred.
Yes.
You were at the shredding machine and he saw you there and he gave you the documents.
Yes, sir. That's my recollection.
Now, you said that Colonel North was pulling the documents from the 5-drawer safe. That's the safe that had previously been in his private office in 392.
That's correct.
Safe which you had not seen open during the entire time that you were in 302.
That's correct.
Did you look at the documents that Colonel North was pulling to be shredded?
No, I didn't.
Well, did you glance to see what kinds of documents they were?
I really didn't take notice, sir. I was just purely doing my job. I was shredding the documents as they went in.
Did Colonel North give you the documents in file folders?
No, he didn't.
He was just pulling documents and handing them to you to shred.
Yes.
Did you notice whether any of those documents were prof messages?
I said before, sir, that I shredded an entire file of prof's messages.
And those were prof messages that you pulled out from your files?
Yes.
Did there come a time while Colonel North was pulling documents that he came across a letter from Felix Rodriguez?
Yes, sir.
And did he make a comment about that letter?
Yes, he did.
What did he say?
My recollection is he said something to the effect of, "Oh, they'll have fun with this," and he tossed it back in the safe.
He said, "They'll have fun with this"?
Yes, sir.
Then he threw the document back into the safe.
Yes, sir.
Did you know who Colonel North was referring to when he said, "They'll have fun with this"?
Past me KL-43 messages probably pulled from separate files. I don't believe they came from the 5-drawer safe.
How would you describe the quantity of documents that were shredded, in feet?
Maybe a foot and a half.
How long did the shredding go on?
Possibly a half hour.
Now, you said before that you came over and started to help Colonel North. You weren't meaning to imply that the shredding was your idea.
No, sir.
Colonel North had already begun that process, correct?
That's my recollection.
And you assisted him, correct?
Yes, sir.
He didn't send you away and say, "I don't want you involved in this."
No, sir.
Okay. Do you recall whether any of the documents you shredded were NSC System 4 memoranda of the type that we've looked at today?
I don't recall.
Do you recall whether there were any memos to the President among the documents that you were asked to shred?
I don't recall, sir. I did not shred individually packages. I shredded 12, 15, 18 pages at once.
Did there come a point during the shredding that the quantity became so great that the machine jammed?
I believe it did. The bag had become full, and as I was shredding it comes into a tunnel and it jammed, yes.
And what did you do?
I placed a call to the Crisis Management Center, and a gentleman by the name of JR came over and...
No relation.
No, he shook the bag, and the shredding material fell, and he reversed the switch and also touched a button much... No, and I'd like to state that I don't know exactly that those were his words.
That's what you recall?
Yes.
Were documents pulled from anywhere other than the 5-drawer safe and your files to be shredded?
I'm not sure, sir. As I said, I think Colonel Earl passed me KL-43 messages probably pulled from separate files. I don't believe they came from the 5-drawer safe.
How would you describe the quantity of documents that were shredded, in feet?
Maybe a foot and a half.
How long did the shredding go on?
Possibly a half hour.
Now, you said before that you came over and started to help Colonel North. you weren't meaning to imply that the shredding was your idea.
No, sir.
Colonel North had already begun that process, correct?
That's my recollection.
And you assisted him, correct?
Yes, sir.
He didn't send you away and say, I don't want you involved in this.
No, sir.
Do you recall whether any of the documents you shredded were NSC System 4 memoranda of the type that we've looked at today?
I don't recall.
Do you recall whether there were any memos to the President among the documents that you were asked to shred?
I don't recall, sir. I did not shred individually packages. I shredded 12, 15, 18 pages at once.
Did there come a point during the shredding that the quantity became so great that the machine jammed?
I believe it did. The bag had become full, and as I was shredding it comes into a tunnel and it jammed, yes.
And what did you do?
I placed a call to the Crisis Management Center, and a gentleman by the name of JR came over and...
No relation.
No, he shook the bag, and the shredding material fell, and he reversed the switch and also touched a button much the same as that you might on a garbage disposal, and the machine unjammed, and he removed the bag, and I believe a new bag was placed in.
Had that ever happened before during your time in Colonel North's office that the shredding machine jammed?
Yes, sir,
When was that?
on several occasions.
Had you ever shredded documents in such quantity?
No, sir.
Was shredding documents in that quantity a normal part of the routine in Suite 392 or Suite 302?
Shredding was a normal process, but I would not say it was at that volume, no.
Well, what did you ordinarily shred when documents were shredded in Colonel North's office?
Sensitive, if a document was typed or not used and it was sensitive, I would shred it. It was used for sensitive materials, and it was also used according to your location to the shredder. I mean, we used a burn bag and a shredder. If you were close to the shredder, you shredded something. If you're close to a burn bag, you put it in the burn bag.
It was an occasional document or one as the spirit moved to be shredded, correct?
Yes.
There had never before been an organized program of shredding on any occasion like the one that occurred on November 21, 1986, right?
That's correct.
Okay. When you left the office, was Colonel North still there on November 21?
I don't recall. We might have all walked out together. I don't recall.
Do you recall Colonel North leaving for a meeting with, which you understood was to be with Tom Green, before you left the office?
I don't recall. I think my recollection is probably blurry. As we noticed on the calendar on November 21st, Colonel North had an appointment with Tom Green at 5:30, and I had recalled that, to my best recollection, that the shredding process took place in the early evening, 6 or 7. I believe that there's a conflict there. It could be that the shredding took place earlier. Colonel North went to the meeting, and he left that evening, and I left following that.
Did you come to work at all over the weekend, November 22, November 23?
No, sir.
Did you speak to Colonel North during that weekend?
No, sir.
Did you come to work, as usual, on Monday morning, November 24th?
Yes, sir.
Did you have a conversation with Colonel North on that Monday morning shortly after you arrived at work?
I walked in the office and popped my head in the door and asked him how his weekend was, and he said it was lousy. I was in here with Justice Department all weekend. And
That was the extent of the conversation?
yes, sir.
Did Colonel North tell you any details of his encounter with any of the Justice Department officials during that weekend?
No, sir.
Did he tell you they had found a document which disturbed him?
No, sir.
Did Colonel North at any point up till then tell you not to mention anything about what had transpired on Friday, November 21?
No, sir.
But you understood from the circumstances that that was a subject you weren't supposed to talk about,
I understood every part of my job to be that way, sir.
including the shredding of documents and the altering of the documents, right?
Yes, sir.
On November 25, the next day, Tuesday, do you recall speaking to Colonel North before the Attorney General's press conference?
Yes, sir.
What did Colonel North say to you?
It was shortly before noon, and there came a time when the conversation started between us, and he, I believe, was in his office, and I was sitting at my desk, and he commented that the president had fired him. And I said, "Oh, Ollie, you know, come on." And he said, "No, I'm serious." And I said, and I became very emotional. In fact, I started crying. I was very upset.
Did Colonel North tell you why he had been fired?
No, sir.
You then watched the Attorney General's press conference, right?
Yes, sir.
And you recall watching that inside Colonel North's office?
Yes, sir.
After the press conference was over, you went to lunch.
Yes, sir.
When you returned from lunch, was Colonel North in the office?
I don't recall that he was.
Had he left you a number where he could be reached?
No, sir.
Was there a time on November 25 when Colonel North did give you a telephone number where he could be reached?
I believe that he called the office and I asked him for a number where he was.
And he gave you a number?
Yes?
And was that his home number?
No, sir.
Was it a number you recognized at the time?
No, sir.
Did you subsequently during the day learn that it was the number of a hotel?
I knew at the time that it was a number of the hotel because he gave me an extension.
Did you know which hotel?
No, I didn't.
And you can't recall now which hotel it was?
I don't believe I ever knew.
Sometime in the afternoon, did you receive a telephone call from the White House operator?
Yes, sir.
Would you tell us about that call?
Sometime in the late afternoon, the phone rang. I answered it. It was the White House operator saying that the president would like to speak with Colonel North. And I asked her if she would hold for a moment. I placed a call to the hotel and told him the president would like to speak with him, and I was going to go ahead and give him the operator the number and have her call. And he said yes, and I did so.
Did you subsequently learn from Colonel North whether he had spoken to the president?
Yes, sir.
And what did Colonel North tell you about his phone call with the president?
He said that the president called him an American hero and that he just didn't know.
The president said that he, the president, just didn't know?
That's what I recall Colonel North saying.
Did Colonel North explain what he understood that reference to mean?
No, sir.
You didn't ask about it?
No, sir.
Okay. In the afternoon of November 25, the same day as the Attorney General's press conference, you recall that Colonel North's office was sealed by the NSC staff.
Yes, sir.
That was under the direction of Brenda Rieger, who is the NSC officer in charge of Freedom of Information Act requests.
Yes, sir.
Now, Ms. Rieger and her assistants, in addition to sealing the office, were boxing up documents, correct, Ms. Hall?
Yes, sir.
And you overheard Commander Coy and Lieutenant Colonel Orwell discussing how they were going to be able to work without their files.
Yes, sir.
What did you do at that point?
I realized that I had not had a chance to complete a lot of current filing. I, in fact, had a stack probably 6 inches high or more, and I pulled the filing from the left-hand corner of my desk and began to separate it into categories to be filed so that they would be able to pull the files and see the material. In doing so, I came across the original altered documents that I had not completed the process at, and in fact, before that, I had forgotten.
Let's just stop there for a moment. This goes back to the testimony you gave earlier. You had prepared new documents, you had altered documents, you hadn't had a chance to substitute those copies for the original copies. You were interrupted, and so you put them in the file on your desk in an accordion-type folder, right?
Yes, and I'd like to state that that at the time I did not know what was going to be happening to Colonel North. I had no idea that he would be fired. I had no idea the real extent of the urgency of that process.
At the time
And in fact, it occurred on a Friday when I was interrupted and came in, had a weekend, and came into to office on Monday and was very busy, and I forgot.
All right, so you had put the documents in your desk file, and as you say, you forgot about them.
Yes.
Now, in looking through that file on November 25 in the afternoon, you found the documents,
Yes, sir.
the altered documents, and that concerned you.
Yes, sir.
Did you find other things that concerned you in your desk file?
I found some prof's notes,
What
which I knew
concerned
had
you?
been shredded. All the prof's notes had been shredded prior to that.
The prof notes you found were the same type that had been shredded on that Friday.
They were prof notes, yes.
Did you find anything else?
minutes of the Tehran meeting in May of 1986.
How did you happen to have those minutes?
I had seen a copy and pulled it so that I might have hopefully an opportunity to sit down and read and maybe understand the process a little more. I thought the minutes would reveal the understanding of what the...
All right, so now you had found the minutes of the Tehran meeting, copies of prof notes, and the documents you had altered on Friday. You were concerned. Why?
I was very emotional at the time, and I was concerned about protecting the initiative, what was the initiative, the Iran initiative and the Contra initiative.
And you knew that certain of those documents had been the same kinds of documents that Colonel North was having shredded on Friday.
I don't know that they were similar. I myself found that the minutes would, what I thought, be revealing, and the prof's notes were personal communications and thoughts between two people that I didn't, you know.
And the others were the documents you had changed.
Yes.
Did you call Colonel North?
Yes, I did.
And what did you say to him?
I called Colonel North because Brenda Rieger and her assistant Bill Van Hoor at the time had indicated they were going to be closing up, and I became panicked at the fact that I had discovered these and that they were going to be closing up, and I didn't know what to do. And so I called him and said that Brenda Rieger was in fact there closing the office, and would he please come back? And he said, no, there's really no need. And I said, no. I whispered very low, at a very low whisper, so that Brenda Rieger would not be able, and others would not be able to hear me, that I was concerned and that he needed to come back. And I was concerned. I tried to convey to him that I had found documents, and I don't know whether that was conveyed or not. I was, as I said, my voice was very low, and I don't know if he quite understood, but he understood in my voice the urgency of coming back to the office, and I insisted that he come back, and he did so.
You tried to signal him that the problem was documents, and that's why he had to come back.
Yes, sir.
Now, did Colonel North tell you to clear someone else into the old executive office building with him for a return trip?
Yes, sir.
Who did he tell you to clear in?
Tom Green?
And did he tell you why Tom Green would be coming with him?
No.
You did clear Colonel North and Tom Green for entry, correct?
Yes.
And what did you do after you finished talking to Colonel North and after he told you that he'd be coming back to the office with Mr. Green?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
After your conversation with Colonel North, what did you do in connection with
Okay.
the documents that you had found that were of concern to you?
I believe I left the original altered documents downstairs and as I said before, I had started to Xerox the altered originals and had been interrupted, and I believe there was a few copies of those altered originals. I took them, the minutes, and the prof's notes, and a stack of other filings that would not look conspicuous, upstairs and sat at a table outside of Craig Coy's office and began to pull the prof's notes and the minutes. And I believe at that time I probably took the altered copies of the altered documents, folded them and placed them inside my boots. I was very nervous since I was outside and I could be seen, and I wanted to do it very quickly, and so out of a panic I ran into Colonel Earle's office and asked him if he would help me pull the prof's notes from the pile, and he did so. At that time I did not tell him about the altered documents or the Tehran minutes, only the prof's notes. The prof's notes were folded, and he was going to take them and put them in his jacket. And I turned to him, he crossed the room to put them in his jacket, and I turned to him and said, no, you shouldn't have to do this, I'll do it. And he returned the prof's notes, and I put them in my back, and turned to him. I mean, the door was left open, and I asked him to watch the door as I did this, and then when I had completed putting the documents in my back, I turned to him and asked him if he could see, and he said no. At that point, I believe we walked downstairs, and just about that time, I think Colonel North and Tom Green entered the office. The phone rang.
Did Colonel Earle go downstairs with you?
I believe so.
And you were now carrying all of the documents on your person?
Yes, sir.
You saw Colonel North and Tom Green downstairs.
Yes, sir.
Colonel North went in to take a telephone call in his private office?
Yes, sir.
Did you follow him in?
Yes, sir.
Did you speak to him?
Yes, sir.
What did you say?
I asked him if he could see anything in my back, and he said no.
And did you indicate that you wanted to give him something at that time?
No.
You then came out and prepared with Colonel North and Mr. Green to leave the office, correct?
Yes, sir.
And was Brenda Rieger inspecting all briefcases that people were carrying as they left the office?
Yes, sir.
And was Colonel North carrying a briefcase?
Yes, sir.
Did she inspect it?
Yes, sir.
Was Mr. Green carrying a briefcase?
I don't recall.
But whoever had a briefcase, she looked at it before it got out of 302, right?
Yes, sir.
Now, when you reached the corridor outside 302, did you indicate to Colonel North something concerning the documents that you had with you?
Yes, I indicated with a gesture or words that I wanted to give him the documents, and he turned to me and just said, no, just wait till we get outside. And we went down the elevator,
All right.
exited the old executive office building on 17th Street, and again, I indicated with a word or gesture that I wanted to pass the documents. And Tom Green said, no, wait till we get inside the car. We crossed 17th Street and got in Tom Green's car on G Street and took off, and I started pulling the documents from my boots and then pulled them from my back, indicated to Colonel North, I believe at this time, that I had not completed the process of replacing the altered documents in the files, and that I had started the Xeroxing, and this is copies of the Xeroxes, but I had in fact left the originals in the office. And as we turned the corner, Tom Green was dropping us both off at the parking lot where our cars were parked. Tom Green turned to me and asked me if I was asked about shredding, what would I say? And I said, we shred every day. And he said, good. We said good night. We got out of the car and went home.
And a response that we shred every day might literally be true in the sense, as you've testified, that documents were shredded from time to time, right?
Yes, sir.
But it would have been untrue if it was meant to describe activities such as that you had engaged in on November 21, right?
Yes, sir.
This was in Mr. Green's car,
Yes, sir.
and you passed the documents to Colonel North in that car,
Yes, sir.
and Mr. Green was at the driver's seat when that happened.
Yes, sir.
That was on November 25, 1986.
Yes, sir.
And Mr. Chairman, as the committees are aware, and I would just point out for the record that Tom Green has advised the committees that he ceased representing Colonel North on the next morning, November 26, 1986. The next day was November 26, 1986. It was a Wednesday. As I understand from our talks, you came to work on that day and took messages for Colonel North, but nothing out of the ordinary occurred as best you recall.
Yes, sir.
Do you recall either on that day or sometime on the 25th advising Commander Coy that you had shredded documents the prior Friday?
No, sir.
Thursday, November 27, was Thanksgiving. Did you receive a call on that day from a lawyer working with the White House counsel?
Yes, I did.
Would you please describe that call for the committees?
I believe it was Jay Stevens from White House Counsel called, I assume in response to the press reports that there had been a shredding incident in Colonel North's office, and he asked me what I knew about it, and I told him that we shred every day. And I led him to believe that there was nothing unusual about what had occurred.
You misled him.
Yes, sir.
On Friday, November 28, the day after Thanksgiving, did you go to the office of Colonel North's attorney to deliver messages for Colonel North?
I believe I did, sir.
And that was the office of Mr. Brendan Sullivan, who was then representing Colonel North?
Yes, sir.
What happened during your visit to Mr. Sullivan's office on that day?
Colonel North introduced me to Brendan Sullivan and said that he was attorney, and I passed the messages that I had from friends and fans of Colonel North to him, and Brendan turned to me and asked me if I would mind sitting down with him and talking with him, that they would be interviewing hundreds of friends and associates regarding Colonel North, and I obliged.
Did you tell Mr. Sullivan on that occasion about the shredding?
No, I didn't. I'd like to state that Colonel North at that time motioned that everything was fine, talk to Brendan, tell him the truth, tell him everything you know, it's fine. At the time, I'm still in the process, in the protective mode, and when I talked to Mr. Sullivan, I wasn't sure exactly what I was supposed to say. I told him that I shredded some profs notes and phone logs. I did not tell him that we shredded all of them, and that was to the extent.
You didn't talk to Mr. Sullivan on that day about the alteration or the removal of the documents?
No, sir.
You came back to the office, and I understand that when you returned, Commander Coy told you that the FBI wanted to interview you that coming weekend, correct?
I believe I became aware of that when I was leaving the office. I was in the mailroom, and Commander Coy walked in the door and said, "Oh, here she is," and I was introduced to 2 FBI agents at that time.
Did you leave the office then with Lieutenant Colonel Earl on November 28?
I'm not sure if the 3 of us left together or if just Colonel Earl and I left together, but I did end up being with Colonel Earl in the parking lot that evening.
Just the 2 of you?
Yes, sir.
What was your conversation?
We had a conversation to the effect that during our being investigated by the FBI, that we would not discuss the fact that I had removed documents from the office.
Both of you agreed that neither of you would disclose that, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. The next day, Saturday, November 28, 1986, would you describe for the committees what happened on that day?
To the best of my recollection, I received a phone call from Diane Coy, who is Commander Craig Coy's wife, stating that Craig was surprised by the fact that he had learned that Colonel Earl had gotten a lawyer and that neither one of them understood, Diane or Craig, why that was, that Craig didn't feel that he needed a lawyer. Why did Bob feel that he needed a lawyer? And I didn't comment on any of that and hung up the phone and called Linda Earl, who is Bob's wife, and asked to speak with him. And she said that he was, in fact, down at the old executive office building being interviewed by the FBI. I asked her if it was true that he had received a lawyer, and she said yes, that he had become, I don't recall the word, but maybe anxious or had felt a little bit of anxiety that evening and had talked with a lawyer until, in fact, midnight that night. And I asked her at that time if she would mind placing a call to the executive office building and asked to speak with him and have him call me. And she said she would do so. She called me back to say that when she placed the call, that the person that answered the phone said that, in fact, he was with the FBI and that he would have to call them after the interview, call her after the interview. She called me back, relayed the message, and I sat back and became very nervous. The more I sat, the nervouser I got. I decided at that time that I should probably contact Brendan Sullivan. I needed to talk to someone. And so I contacted Brendan, and he agreed that he would see me. And I drove down to his office and disclosed at that time that I had removed documents from the office, and he advised me that I should seek counsel.
And you did?
I did.
Ms. Hall, have you spoken, when was the last time that you spoke to Colonel North?
I believe it was the night of his wife's birthday, March 9th.
You haven't spoken to him since then?
No, sir.
And at no time before then or after then have you discussed with him any of the testimony you plan to give, correct?
Absolutely not.
And the same was true with respect to your testimony for the independent counsel and here, correct?
That's correct.
And you've testified to the facts as you best recall them and know them.
That's right.
I want to thank you for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no further questions.
The joint committees will recess at this time and meet tomorrow morning at 9:30 when Ms. Hall will continue as a witness, and we will begin questions with Mr. Eggleston.
Right.